I don't know exactly when I started feeling it. That's part of what makes this so difficult to explain. If there had been a specific moment, some obvious event I could point to, I think I'd feel more confident talking about it. Instead, what I have is a vague sense that something shifted somewhere along the way, and I've spent the last year trying to figure out whether that shift happened in my marriage or inside my own head. My wife and I have been married for 11 years. For most of those years, I would have described us as solid. Not perfect. Not one of those couples who post anniversary paragraphs on social media or spend every waking moment together. We had jobs, responsibilities, bills, routines. The usual things. But there was comfort in that routine. We ate dinner together most nights. We watched shows neither of us cared much about. We argued occasionally about household stuff, money, whose turn it was to handle some annoying errand. Normal marriage problems. At least that's what I thought. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether I missed something important. Then I immediately wonder if that's exactly the kind of thinking that's causing all of this. About a year ago, life became busier for both of us. Nothing dramatic. Her department at work was restructuring. My workload increased after a coworker left. We were both tired more often. Conversations became shorter. Again, normal. At least that's what everyone tells you marriage eventually becomes. There wasn't less love exactly. There was just less energy. She stopped lingering in conversations the way she used to. I'd tell a story about something that happened at work and notice her attention drifting. Sometimes she'd apologize. Sorry, long day. And honestly, I believed her. I still do. Most days. Other times I'd ask about her day and get a quick summary instead of the detailed stories she used to tell. But people change. People get older. People get stressed. I told myself all of those things. The truth is, if you had asked me then whether something was wrong, I would have said no. Maybe not enthusiastically, but I would have said no. There were still good moments. Saturday mornings with coffee, inside jokes, random texts during the day, a hand on my shoulder when she passed behind my chair. Nothing about her behavior seemed suspicious. Nothing. That's what bothers me now. Because whatever happened later didn't start with some giant red flag. It started with tiny things that barely registered at the time. The kind of things you only notice when you begin looking backward. One night we were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. She was scrolling through her phone. I was half watching a movie. At some point I realized we hadn't spoken for almost 40 minutes. Not because we were angry, not because anything was wrong. We were just existing in the same room separately. I remember looking over at her, the glow from her screen reflected in her glasses. She smiled at something she was reading. Not a huge smile, just a small one. And for some reason I felt an unexpected flash of loneliness. It passed quickly. I didn't mention it. I almost forgot about it. But now, months later, that memory keeps coming back to me. Not because it proves anything. It doesn't. Because it was the first moment I can remember feeling like there might be a version of her life I wasn't entirely part of anymore. And once that thought appeared, however briefly, it became impossible to completely forget. At the time, though, I dismissed it. I went to bed. She came upstairs a little later. We talked about groceries, made plans for the weekend, turned off the lights. Everything felt normal, or normal enough. The problem is that sometimes, when I think about that night now, I realize I can't remember what she was smiling at. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, that bothers me more than it probably should. Because a few weeks later, another small thing happened, and unlike the first one, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The second thing wasn't suspicious, at least not objectively. That's the problem with almost every memory I have from this period. If I described any individual event by itself, it sounds completely harmless. Most of them probably were harmless. But when enough harmless things accumulate, your brain starts trying to connect them into something larger. Whether that larger thing actually exists is another question. A few weeks after the night on the couch, my wife started staying later at work. Not dramatically later. 30 minutes sometimes. An hour occasionally. Her company was still going through changes, and she'd been talking about increased responsibilities for months. It made sense. I never challenged it. In fact, I remember encouraging her. When she called one evening to say she'd be home late, I told her not to worry and offered to make dinner. Nothing about the conversation felt strange, but over time I noticed something I couldn't quite explain. She talked less about work than she used to. Not never, just less. Earlier in our marriage, I'd hear detailed stories about coworkers, meetings, office drama, ridiculous management decisions. The kind of mundane details couples share because they're part of each other's lives. Now the stories felt abbreviated. Busy day, tiring meeting, same stuff as always. I didn't think much of it initially. Then one evening we were driving home from dinner with friends. One of our friends asked how a particular project at her office was going. My wife answered with surprising detail. News, problems, updates, stories. She sounded engaged, animated, interested. Afterward, driving home alone together, I casually asked another question about the project. Her answer was short, almost dismissive. Nothing new really. I remember feeling confused, not hurt, just confused. The discrepancy stuck with me. Then I felt guilty for noticing it. People don't owe their spouses a complete transcript of every workday. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she didn't feel like talking. Maybe I was reading meaning into something meaningless. That became a recurring pattern. Noticed something, question it, immediately argue against my own suspicion. A month later, she started carrying her phone around more often. Again, not secretly, not hiding it, just keeping it nearby. She used to leave it on kitchen counters, coffee tables, random surfaces throughout the house. Now it seemed to travel with her. Bathroom, laundry room, bedroom, kitchen. I noticed because it represented a change, not because it looked suspicious. At least I don't think it did. One night I almost asked about it. Then I stopped myself. What exactly would I have said? Why do you carry your phone now? The question sounded ridiculous even in my head. People carry phones. That's what phones are for. I felt embarrassed for even noticing. The worst part was that I still trusted her, at least consciously. If someone had directly asked whether I thought she was cheating, I would have laughed. The idea seemed absurd. We'd built an entire life together. A house, shared finances, years of memories, alliance, history. Trust doesn't disappear overnight, but something else had appeared alongside that trust. A quiet discomfort, a feeling that certain interactions had become harder to predict. Sometimes she seemed exactly like herself, warm, playful, present. Other times she felt distracted in ways I couldn't identify, like part of her attention existed somewhere else. I started watching for patterns. Then I hated myself for watching. One Friday evening we were making dinner together. She was chopping vegetables while texting someone. Nothing unusual. People text. But at one point she smiled at her screen. The same kind of small smile I'd seen months earlier on the couch. Without thinking, I asked who she was talking to. She answered immediately. Amanda, one of her coworkers. No hesitation, no defensiveness, no reason to doubt her. The conversation moved on, yet later that night, lying awake beside her, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't wondering who she'd been texting. I was wondering why I'd asked. And that question bothered me far more than the answer, because for the first time, I had to consider a possibility that made me deeply uncomfortable. Maybe the real problem wasn't her behavior. Maybe the real problem was what was starting to happen inside my own mind. Then, a few days later, I overheard a name I didn't recognize, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I remembered it. The name was Daniel. That was it. Nothing dramatic. No secret phone call. No whispered conversation. No suspicious message popping up on a screen. Just a name. She was talking about work while unloading groceries. Something about a meeting. Someone missing a deadline. Someone else having to clean up the mess afterward. Daniel was mentioned in passing, no differently than any of the dozens of coworkers I'd heard about over the years. I didn't think much about it at the time. The strange part came later. A few days afterward, she mentioned him again. Then again the following week. Not constantly, just often enough that I noticed. And once I noticed, I couldn't seem to stop noticing. I want to be very clear about something. There was absolutely nothing inappropriate in any of these conversations. Nothing flirtatious, nothing intimate, nothing even remotely alarming. If anything, most of her comments sounded mildly annoyed. Daniel forgot to send the report. Daniel mixed up the schedule. Daniel booked the wrong conference room. Normal workplace complaints. The kind of comments people make every day. Yet my brain latched onto the repetition, not because it proved anything, because I couldn't remember hearing his name before. I started wondering whether he was new. Then I wondered why I cared. Then I wondered why I was wondering why I cared. That became the exhausting loop my thoughts operated on. Around that time, I noticed another small change. My wife became harder to read emotionally. Not distant exactly, just inconsistent. One evening, she'd come home and immediately tell me about her day. The next evening, she'd barely say 10 words before disappearing into a shower. Some weekends, she'd suggest going out together. Other weekends, she'd spend most of the day occupied with her own things. Every individual behavior felt normal. The inconsistency was what bothered me. I couldn't establish a pattern, and for some reason that made me more anxious. Human beings seem to prefer explanations, even unpleasant ones. Uncertainty is harder. A clear problem at least gives you something to respond to. Uncertainty just sits there. I started paying closer attention, not intentionally at first. At least that's what I told myself. I wasn't checking her phone. I wasn't following her. I wasn't investigating. But I found myself noticing details I previously would have ignored. How long she spent replying to messages. Whether she seemed distracted during conversations. How often she mentioned work. How often she didn't. And every time I caught myself doing it, I felt ashamed. Because what if nothing was wrong? What if I was slowly turning into one of those suspicious spouses who destroy perfectly healthy relationships through paranoia? That possibility scared me more than infidelity. One night, I called my older brother. We aren't especially emotional people, but we've always been close. I told him some version of what had been bothering me. Not everything, just enough. I described the distance, the changes, the feeling that something was different. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Do you think she's cheating? I stared at the wall. I don't know. Do you have any reason to think that? Another pause. No. The answer came out faster than I expected. Because it was true. I didn't have a reason. I had observations, feelings, interpretations, questions, but not evidence. My brother was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that ended up living in my head for months. Sometimes people change. Sometimes relationships go through phases. And sometimes your gut notices things before your brain can explain them. The hard part is figuring out which one you're dealing with. I hated that answer. Not because it was wrong. Because it didn't help. It left every possibility open. After the call, I sat alone in the living room for almost an hour, trying to decide whether I felt reassured or more worried. I honestly couldn't tell. A week later, something happened that made me start revisiting old memories. Memories I'd never questioned before. And once I started re-examining the past, I found myself wondering whether I'd missed signs that weren't signs at all. If you've never been caught in a cycle of suspicion without evidence, it's difficult to explain how your mind starts working. You don't suddenly become convinced of something. At least I didn't. It was almost the opposite. I became less certain about everything. Every memory seemed to develop two competing versions. One innocent, one suspicious, and I couldn't decide which one was real. It started with ordinary moments from the previous year. A conference she attended with coworkers, a happy hour she went to after work, a weekend when she seemed unusually tired. Things I hadn't thought about twice when they happened. Now I found myself mentally reopening them like old case files. The conference, for example, she'd been gone for 2 nights. I remembered her calling me from the hotel. I remembered us talking before bed. I remembered absolutely nothing unusual. Yet now I found myself wondering whether there had been something I missed. Then I'd immediately recognize how ridiculous that sounded. Missed what? There was no event, no clue, no contradiction, just an absence of certainty. And somehow that absence itself had become suspicious. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I was searching for a narrative, a story that would explain why I felt unsettled. The problem was that every story I created eventually collapsed under scrutiny. Maybe she was pulling away emotionally, except some days she wasn't. Maybe work stress was changing her behavior, except that didn't explain everything either. Maybe I was becoming insecure. Maybe I was depressed. Maybe I was projecting unrelated anxieties onto my marriage. Every explanation felt partially correct and partially incomplete. The uncertainty followed me everywhere. At work, driving, lying awake at night. I began paying attention to time, not intentionally, just enough to notice. If she said she'd be home around 6 and arrived at 6:30, I noticed. If she mentioned stopping at a store, I noticed. If she seemed distracted during dinner, I noticed. The disturbing thing wasn't what I noticed. It was how much mental energy I devoted to interpreting it. A delay of 20 minutes could generate an hour of internal analysis. Then I'd feel disgusted with myself afterward. One evening, she came home cheerful, genuinely cheerful, more relaxed than she'd been in weeks. We ordered takeout, watched a movie, laughed together. For several hours, all my concerns disappeared. I remember thinking, see, this is what normal looks like. You've been overthinking everything. I slept better that night than I had in months. Then the next day she seemed distant again. Not cold, not angry, just elsewhere. And suddenly all my certainty evaporated. I started noticing how much my emotional state depended on her mood. If she was affectionate, I felt foolish for worrying. If she seemed distracted, I felt alarmed. I was becoming a human weather vane, constantly adjusting based on signals I didn't understand. Around that time, Daniel's name surfaced again. Not frequently, just enough. A project, a meeting, a deadline. Nothing more. I hated how quickly my attention locked onto it. The name had become a trigger. The moment I heard it, part of my brain woke up, listening, analyzing, looking for meaning, and finding none. One Saturday afternoon, while my wife was visiting her sister, I sat alone in the house scrolling through old photos. At first, I wasn't looking for anything. Then I realized I was comparing her smile now to her smile then, comparing vacations, comparing holidays, comparing random moments frozen in pictures, trying to determine whether she'd changed, trying to determine whether we'd changed. The exercise was useless. Photographs only capture certainty. They never capture doubt. When she got home that evening, she kissed me on the cheek and asked what I'd been doing. For a split second, I considered telling her everything. The anxiety, the confusion, the endless analysis. Instead, I said I'd been organizing pictures. She smiled and said we should make an album sometime. Then she walked into the kitchen, and I remember watching her go, feeling strangely disconnected from reality. Not because I believed she was hiding something, but because I no longer trusted my own ability to judge what was real. A few days later, I finally decided to bring up my concerns, not as an accusation, not even as a suspicion, just as a conversation. I thought it might calm my mind. Instead, it became the beginning of something much more confusing. I spent 3 days rehearsing the conversation, not because I planned to accuse her of anything. I wasn't even sure what I believed. The problem was that I couldn't figure out how to describe what was bothering me without sounding irrational. Something feels different. What does that even mean? Different how? Different compared to when? Different because of actual changes, or because I was paying attention in ways I never had before? Every version sounded weak. They aren't fair. Still, the anxiety had reached a point where keeping it entirely to myself felt impossible. One Tuesday evening after dinner, we were sitting in the living room. Nothing dramatic had happened that day. No traitor, no suspicious event. Maybe that was why I chose that moment. I didn't want the conversation to be connected to a specific incident. I wanted it to be honest. Can I ask you something? She muted the television. Sure. I remember my heart pounding much harder than the situation warranted. I wasn't confronting a betrayal. I wasn't presenting evidence. I was simply trying to talk to my wife. Yet somehow it felt terrifying. I feel like we've been a little disconnected lately. She looked surprised. Not guilty. Not defensive. Just surprised. What do you mean? And immediately I struggled to answer, because I didn't actually know. I tried explaining the emotional distance, the shorter conversations, the feeling that we weren't quite as present with each other. As I spoke, the concerns sounded less convincing than they had inside my head. Almost trivial, like I was describing normal fluctuations in a long marriage. She listened quietly. When I finished, she sat there for a moment. Then she nodded. I guess I've been stressed. I remember feeling relieved, not because she'd admitted anything, because she'd acknowledged something. Any explanation felt better than uncertainty. What kind of stress? She shrugged. Where? Life. Everything. The answer wasn't wrong. It was just broad. Broad enough that it explained everything and nothing. We talked for almost an hour. The strange thing was that the conversation felt productive while it was happening. But afterward, I couldn't identify any concrete conclusions. She agreed she'd been distracted. She agreed she'd been tired. She agreed we'd probably spent less quality time together recently. All reasonable observations. Yet none of it addressed the deeper thing I couldn't quite articulate. The feeling that something had shifted. At one point, I almost mentioned my worries directly. Not cheating specifically, just my uncertainty. But every time I tried, the words felt absurd. What exactly would I say? I think something might be wrong, but I don't know what, and I don't know why I think that. How do you have a productive discussion around that? Near the end of the conversation, she asked a question that caught me off guard. Are you unhappy? I wasn't expecting it. The question lingered between us. Not unhappy, I said eventually. Then what? I didn't have an answer, and that scared me, because for months I'd been obsessively analyzing her behavior. Yet when asked to explain my concerns clearly, I couldn't. The conversation ended gently. We hugged, watched television, went to bed. On the surface, everything seemed better. For a few days, it actually was. She seemed more attentive. We talked more, spent more time together. Part of me wondered whether I'd imagined the entire problem. Maybe communication really had been the issue. Maybe all couples drift occasionally and reconnect. Maybe that was all this had ever been. Then, about a week later, something happened that reopened every doubt. The frustrating part was that even now, looking back, I can't decide whether it was meaningful at all, because what I saw could be interpreted in at least 3 completely different ways. And that's when uncertainty started becoming something darker than suspicion. It started becoming obsession. The thing that reopened everything was so small that I'm almost embarrassed to write it. If someone else told me this story, I'd probably tell them they were overthinking. Maybe I was. Maybe I still am. It happened on a Thursday night. My wife was sitting at the kitchen table answering emails on her laptop while I cleaned up after dinner. Nothing unusual. We talked casually while she worked. At one point, her phone vibrated beside her. She glanced at the screen, noticed who it was, then turned the phone face down. That was it. That was the entire event. No panic, no hiding, no rushing to another room. Just a brief glance and a flipped phone. A completely normal action. One that people perform hundreds of times without thinking. The problem wasn't what happened. The problem was what happened inside my head afterward. Because once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. Had she always done that? Or was it new? I genuinely couldn't remember. The more I tried to recall, the less certain I became. And uncertainty, I've learned, has a way of creating its own gravity. It pulls every thought toward itself. The next few days were awful. Not because anything suspicious happened, because nothing happened. My brain started scanning constantly, searching, muttering, looking for patterns, then questioning the patterns, then questioning the fact that I was looking for patterns. I became exhausted by my own thoughts. One morning, she kissed me goodbye before work, a perfectly normal goodbye. After she left, I found myself analyzing whether the kiss felt different, longer, shorter, distracted, affectionate. I sat in my car afterward feeling ridiculous. What kind of person does that? What kind of husband dissects a goodbye kiss like forensic evidence? That realization scared me, not because it suggested she was cheating, because it suggested I might be losing perspective. For the first time, I seriously considered whether the problem might be anxiety rather than reality. Maybe I'd become hypervigilant. Maybe months of uncertainty had trained my brain to treat normal behavior as suspicious. I even scheduled a few sessions with a therapist. I didn't tell my wife, not because I was hiding it, because I wasn't sure how to explain it. The therapist listened patiently while I described everything: the emotional distance, the inconsistency, the uncertainty, the lack of evidence. When I finished, she asked a question similar to the one my brother had asked months earlier. What do you believe is most likely happening? I stared at her and realized I had no idea, not a clue. That was the entire problem. If I genuinely believed my wife was having an affair, at least the situation would have structure. If I genuinely believed nothing was wrong, I could let it go. Instead, I existed somewhere in between, suspended, unable to move toward certainty in either direction. The therapist suggested something that sounded simple but turned out to be impossible. Try observing your thoughts without treating them as facts. I laughed, not because it was bad advice, because it described exactly what I was failing to do. Every observation immediately transformed into a theory. Every theory transformed into a possibility. Every possibility demanded analysis. The cycle never ended. Then there was Daniel. Not because of anything he did. I still hadn't met him. Still knew almost nothing about him. But the name kept appearing. Occasionally in stories. Occasionally in passing comments. Occasionally in conversations about work. Always ordinary. Always harmless. Yet my mind attached significance to it simply because it was one of the few fixed points in all this uncertainty. One evening, I searched his name on social media. I'm not proud of that. I found what appeared to be his profile. A normal-looking guy, nothing remarkable. A few public photos, mutual connections from her workplace. No evidence of anything. I closed the page feeling ashamed, then reopened it 10 minutes later. That scared me more than anything I discovered, because I wasn't behaving like someone pursuing truth anymore. I was behaving like someone desperately trying to reduce uncertainty, and those aren't always the same thing. A few weeks later, something happened that felt closer to evidence than anything before. For about 20 minutes, I genuinely thought I was finally going to get an answer. Instead, those 20 minutes would leave me more confused than ever. The closest I ever came to certainty lasted less than 20 minutes. Looking back, I'm not even sure it qualifies as a real event. At the time, though, it felt enormous. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I had left work early for a dentist appointment. Afterward, I stopped at a coffee shop and sat there longer than I intended, answering emails and putting off going home. My wife wasn't supposed to be home for another few hours. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to drive back. Traffic was light. The weather was gray. An ordinary day. Nothing memorable. Until I pulled into our neighborhood. As I turned onto our street, I noticed a car parked several houses down from ours. Not directly in front. Not in our driveway. Just nearby. I wouldn't normally have paid attention. The only reason I noticed was because I recognized it, or thought I did. The car looked similar to one I had seen in a photo online while looking at Daniel's social media profile weeks earlier. Same model, same color, maybe even the same year. Immediately, I felt ridiculous. There are thousands of identical cars, probably tens of thousands. My brain knew that. My body reacted differently. By the time I parked, my heart was racing. I sat there staring through the windshield, trying to calm down, trying to think logically. The car wasn't at my house. The car might not even belong to him. I wasn't even certain the social media profile I'd found was the correct person. Every piece of the thought process was built on assumptions. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went inside. The house was empty, silent, exactly as expected. My wife was still at work. Nothing was wrong. I stood in the kitchen feeling foolish. Then something happened. My phone buzzed. A text from her. Meeting ended early. Heading home soon. The message was completely normal, yet for some reason it intensified my anxiety. Maybe because it arrived at exactly the moment I was already unsettled. I don't know. I spent the next half hour spiraling, looking out windows, checking the street, watching cars pass. Eventually, the vehicle I'd noticed drove away. I never saw who was inside. Not clearly. Maybe a man. Maybe not. Maybe someone from the neighborhood. Maybe a delivery driver. Maybe nobody connected to my life at all. The uncertainty was maddening. When my wife got home, she seemed completely normal. She kissed me hello, asked about my appointment, complained about traffic. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, nothing that matched the elaborate narrative my brain had spent 30 minutes constructing. I remember studying her face while she talked, searching for signs of deception, then hating myself for doing it. Because what exactly was I evaluating? A person can look normal and lie. A person can look nervous and tell the truth. Human beings are terrible lie detectors, especially when emotions are involved. That night I barely slept, not because I believed I'd discovered evidence, because I couldn't decide whether I'd almost discovered evidence. There's a difference. One possibility meant my instincts were finally noticing something real. The other meant I'd become so hyper-focused that random events were acquiring meaning they never possessed. The next morning, I felt physically exhausted. My concentration at work was awful. I reread emails multiple times, forgot conversations, made mistakes. For the first time, the situation began affecting parts of my life beyond the marriage itself. The uncertainty wasn't staying contained anymore. It was spreading, and what frightened me most was that I no longer knew which outcome I feared more. Finding proof, or discovering there had never been anything to prove. Because if there was no hidden truth waiting at the end of this, then I'd have to confront another possibility. That months of suspicion had been built almost entirely from my own inability to tolerate uncertainty. A possibility that became much harder to ignore after what happened next. Because shortly afterward, I reached a point where I genuinely stopped trusting my own judgment. The breakdown didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic night, no shouting, no discovery, no single moment where everything snapped. It was more like erosion, a slow wearing away of confidence until there was almost nothing left underneath. By then, nearly a year had passed since I first started feeling that vague sense that something was different. A year of observation, a year of doubt, a year of building and dismantling theories. I was exhausted, not because I had evidence, because I didn't. Every day felt like waking up in the middle of a mystery that might not actually exist. Some mornings I'd look at my wife and feel overwhelming affection. I'd watch her making coffee, feeding the dog, laughing at some stupid video on her phone, and I'd feel ashamed. Ashamed that I'd spent so much time questioning her. Ashamed that I'd mentally investigated someone who had never given me a concrete reason not to trust her. On those days, I would silently promise myself I was finished. No more analyzing, no more monitoring, no more searching for patterns. I would be a normal husband again. Then something tiny would happen. A delayed response to a text, a distracted expression, an unexplained change of plans, and suddenly every promise would collapse. The anxiety always returned, sometimes stronger than before. The hardest part wasn't the suspicion. It was the constant uncertainty about whether the suspicion itself was justified. I began feeling disconnected from my own perceptions. One evening I noticed how carefully I was listening to her stories. Not because I was interested, because I was checking them for consistency. The realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't participating in conversations anymore. I was auditing them, and that terrified me. Because it wasn't who I wanted to be. I started withdrawing emotionally, not intentionally, more out of exhaustion. Every interaction felt loaded, not because of anything she was doing, because of what was happening inside me. I became quieter, more distracted, more distant. Ironically, some of the emotional gap I'd originally noticed now seemed to be coming from me. That possibility haunted me. What if I'd become so focused on detecting distance that I had started creating it? What What if the marriage was deteriorating because I no longer knew how to be present inside it? Around that time, my wife asked whether everything was okay. The question caught me completely off guard. We were cleaning up after dinner. Nothing significant had happened. She simply looked at me and said, "You seem somewhere else lately." The comment stayed with me for days, because it mirrored exactly what I'd been thinking about her. I wanted to tell her everything. The fear, the confusion, the endless uncertainty. Instead, I gave a vague answer about stress. She accepted it, or appeared to. But after that conversation, something changed. Not in her. In me. For the first time, I realized that my private obsession wasn't actually private anymore. It was affecting the marriage. Whether my suspicions were justified or not, whether they were real or imagined, the consequences were becoming real. A few weeks later, I had what was probably the worst night of the entire year. I woke up around 3 in the morning. My wife was asleep beside me. The room was dark, silent. Nothing had happened. No argument, no discovery, no traitor. Yeah, I found myself lying there completely overwhelmed. Not by fear that she was cheating, by the realization that I might never know. The possibility hit me with unexpected force. What if there was no answer coming? What if there would never be evidence? Never be certainty? Never be a confession? Never be proof of innocence either? Just ambiguity stretching endlessly into the future. I got out of bed and sat alone in the living room until sunrise, trying to imagine how long a person could live inside that kind of uncertainty, trying to decide whether trust meant believing despite doubt, or whether it meant requiring less certainty than I seemed capable of living with. By morning, I felt emotionally hollow, and for the first time, I started considering a conversation I had avoided for nearly a year. Not a discussion, not a check-in, a direct confrontation. The idea scared me, because deep down, I suspected the conversation wouldn't give me answers. I was afraid it would give me something much worse. More uncertainty. I waited almost 3 weeks before bringing it up. Not because I changed my mind, because I was trying to figure out how to do it without causing damage I couldn't undo. Once certain words enter a marriage, they don't disappear. You can apologize for them, explain them, take them back, but you can't erase the fact that they were spoken. And I knew that if I handled this badly, I could permanently alter the way my wife looked at me. Maybe she'd see me as insecure, maybe paranoid, maybe controlling. Maybe she'd start filtering everything she did through the awareness that I was watching. The irony was that I didn't want any of those things. I wanted clarity, or at least enough clarity to quiet my own mind. The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon. Rainy day, no distractions, no plans. We were sitting at the dining room table drinking coffee. I remember staring at the steam rising from my mug while trying to find the words. Finally, I said, "Can I ask you something difficult?" Immediately, she looked concerned, not defensive. Concerned. Okay. Even then, I almost backed out. But I'd spent too many months carrying this alone. I feel like something's been off between us for a while. She nodded slowly, not arguing, not agreeing, just listening. I took a deep breath. Then I crossed a line I'd been avoiding for nearly a year. Sometimes I wonder if there's something you're not telling me. The words hung there. Hobbit. Uncomfortable. I watched her expression carefully. Probably too carefully. She looked surprised, then confused, then hurt. At least that's how it appeared. But interpretation had become unreliable territory for me. I no longer trusted my own readings of people. What do you mean? She asked quietly. And there it was again. The impossible question. What exactly did I mean? Because I still didn't have facts. Only feelings. Observations. Patterns. That's. I tried explaining. The distance I'd felt. The inconsistency. The sense that she'd become harder to understand. I even admitted how uncertain I was. How much I'd questioned myself. How much I'd worried about being unfair. The entire time she listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she asked, "Are you asking if I'm cheating on you?" Hearing the words spoken aloud felt surreal. For months it had existed mostly inside my head. Now it sat between us. Visible. I remember staring at the table. I don't know what I'm asking. It was probably the most honest answer I'd given all year. Because I genuinely didn't know. Part of me wanted reassurance. Part of me wanted truth. Part of me wanted relief from uncertainty. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. My wife leaned back in her chair. She looked exhausted. Not angry, not panicked, just tired. Then she said something that would replay in my head for months afterward. I don't know how to prove a negative. At the time, I didn't know what to do with that response. Even now, I'm not sure. Was it a denial? A deflection? A frustrated observation? All three? None of them? I honestly don't know. The conversation became increasingly circular after that. I described feelings. She'd respond to feelings. I'd ask whether something had changed. She'd say she wasn't sure. She admitted she'd been stressed, admitted she'd felt disconnected at times, admitted that the marriage hadn't felt perfect lately, but none of those admissions clarified the central question. If anything, they expanded it. At one point, she looked directly at me and asked, "What answer would actually make you feel better?" I couldn't respond, because I realized something awful. I wasn't sure there was an answer. Not anymore. Months of uncertainty had altered something fundamental. Even if she denied everything completely, part of me would wonder. If she became emotional, I'd wonder why. If she remained calm, I'd wonder why. Every possible reaction had acquired multiple interpretations. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. When it ended, neither of us seemed satisfied, neither angry either, just drained. We sat together in silence for a long time afterward, the rain tapping against the windows, coffee gone cold, questions still hanging in the air. And somewhere during that silence, I began realizing that whatever happened next, the conversation had not brought me closer to certainty. It had only revealed how impossible certainty might actually be. That realization followed me into the weeks that came after, and eventually, it forced me to confront a question far more frightening than whether my wife had ever betrayed me, whether I would ever trust my own judgment again. It's been 8 months since that conversation. I wish I could tell you what happened afterward. I wish I could tell you I found evidence, or found peace, or discovered that everything had been a misunderstanding. Stories are supposed to move toward conclusions. Real life doesn't always cooperate. The truth is that I still don't know. And that's the part people struggle to understand when I try to explain it. They assume uncertainty is temporary, a stage between question and answer. But sometimes uncertainty becomes the answer, not because it's satisfying, because it's all that's available. In the months after our conversation, some things improved, at least on the surface. My wife and I made more time for each other. We went out more often, talked more intentionally, spent fewer evenings drifting into separate corners of the house. There were moments when I genuinely felt hopeful, moments when I looked at her and wondered how I'd ever allowed myself to become so suspicious. She seemed present, warm, engaged, the woman I'd spent more than a decade building a life with. During those periods, the anxiety loosened its grip. Not completely, but enough that I could imagine a future where all of this eventually faded into the background. Then something small would happen, not suspicious, just ambiguous. A delayed reply, a mood shift, a canceled plan, and I'd feel the old uncertainty stirring again. Not as intensely as before, but still there, waiting. The strange thing is that I no longer spend much time thinking about Daniel. The name gradually lost significance. Maybe because nothing ever came from it. Maybe because I eventually realized how much meaning I'd attached to a person I barely knew. Or maybe because the deeper issue was never really Daniel. It was uncertainty itself. I've thought a lot about trust over the last year, more than I ever wanted to. I used to think trust meant confidence. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe trust is what exists in the absence of confidence. Maybe trust is the decision to continue despite unanswered questions. Or maybe that's just another story people tell themselves when certainty becomes unavailable. I honestly don't know. Sometimes I revisit old memories, not as often as I used to, but occasionally. A conference, the phone, the conversations, the moments that once felt important. What's unsettling is how differently they look depending on my mood. On some days they appear completely innocent. On other days they seem loaded with possible meanings. The facts never change, only the interpretation. And after enough time, that realization becomes its own kind of prison. Because if every memory contains multiple versions of itself, how do you ever decide which version is true? A few months ago, my therapist asked whether I believed my wife was cheating. The question should have been simple. After everything, I still couldn't answer it. Not because I was hiding the truth, because I genuinely don't know. I think that's what frustrates people. They want a verdict. Guilty, and then there's other. Trustworthy, untrustworthy. Those categories feel comforting. Reality often refuses to fit inside them. My wife and I are still together. Some days are good, some are harder. She still has stressful weeks, still gets distracted, still laughs at things on her phone, still sometimes seems distant, still sometimes seems deeply connected. In other words, she is still a human being, and human beings are inconsistent. Maybe that's all this ever was, or maybe it wasn't. I don't know. That's the sentence I've been living with. I don't know. I don't know whether my instincts were detecting something real. I don't know whether anxiety slowly distorted my perception. I don't know whether there were truths I never uncovered. I don't know whether there was ever anything to uncover in the first place. What I do know is that uncertainty changes you, not dramatically, not all at once. It reshapes the way you look at memories, conversations, silences, even yourself. The hardest consequence wasn't losing confidence in my wife. It was losing confidence in my ability to tell the difference between intuition and fear. And maybe that's why I'm writing this now. Not because I finally found answers, but because after nearly 2 years of searching, I've started to suspect there may not be any. My wife is upstairs as I write this. She is reading in bed. A few minutes ago, she texted me asking if I was coming up soon. A completely ordinary message. I stared at it longer than necessary. Then I caught myself. I smiled, put down the phone, and for a brief moment, I honestly couldn't tell whether I was learning to trust again or simply learning to live without certainty. This is the end of the story. Don't forget to share with your friends, comment, like, and subscribe.